In Great Britain, The Economist reported on a poll recently. What they said was, young Britons have turned strikingly liberal in a classical sense. They're talking about a poll. The young want Leviathan to butt out of their paychecks as well as their bedrooms. Britain's youth are not just more liberal than their elders, they are also more liberal than any previous generation. And then, you can believe this if you want to, but I read it on the internet. 81.2% of the protesters in the public square in Turkey told pollsters they were libertarian. I don't know what libertarian means in Turkey. I don't know what the actual question was, but that's what was reported on a Turkish newspaper website. So this has been fun lately, but that's all politics, and political attitudes can change. And what's important for us here at the Cato Institute, for libertarian scholars, for the libertarian movement in general, I think, is to develop and promote the principles of liberty and limited government. And in that regard, we cannot count on politicians. It's up to us, all of us broadly, but still up to us, few enough of us that we need to accept personal responsibility for this. First thing we need to talk about is what we stand for. What are the principles that we believe in? I like to use Adam Smith's phrase, the simple system of natural liberty. Make a few rules like don't hit other people and don't take their stuff, and then let people do as they will, and you get a simple system of natural liberty. And it creates economic growth, progress that was unprecedented in the world before Adam Smith's time. Another way to put it, a more specific way, I think, is no one has the right to initiate aggression against the person or property of anyone else. That, I think, is the more specific core of libertarianism. And that, too, can be summed up as don't hit other people and don't take their stuff. That's what it means. No one has the right to initiate aggression against people who have not themselves used aggression. If we follow these rules, we get a society of progress and economic growth and a broadening standard of living, not for the rich, but for everybody, for the poor, for the middle class. And remember, everybody in the middle class was poor a couple of generations ago. That's what capitalism will do for you. And that's important. But to my mind, at least, we're not talking just about utilitarianism or better outcomes. If you just say, as a scientist, how could I improve the lot of the worst off in the United States or the world? The answer would be the rules of libertarianism. But to me, it's not just about economics. It is that we believe that people have a right to be free, that we believe that people have a right to live their lives as they choose, so long as they don't interfere with the equal rights of others. And so we are for the better outcomes that are produced, but what we're really for is freedom and limited government. Some of you may have read or seen on television the very long-standing journalist Robert Novak. He used to be on CNN and Fox toward the end of his life. He had a column in the Washington Post for 40 or 50 years. And I had an opportunity to be at a little luncheon for him when he published his memoirs not long before he died. And I remember one of the things he said there was, whenever I get invited to deliver a commencement address at a college, which is like about 1% as many times as all the liberal journalists get, but when I get invited to give one of the things I tell the young people is always love your country but never trust your government. That's a pretty good principle in the United States and Turkey and a lot of other places. Love your country, love the people, love its history, but don't trust the government any farther than you can throw it. It is a lesson we have to continually relearn, and some people have a lot of trouble with it. About a year ago, on the 4th of July, in America's leading newspaper, the New York Times, an author named Kurt Anderson took the occasion of Independence Day, the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, to complain at length that there's too much freedom in modern America. But he wrote some interesting things. He wrote, "For hippies and bohemians, as for business people and investors, extreme individualism has been triumphant." And reminiscing about his youth in the 60s, I guess, he said, back then, greed as well as homosexuality was a love that dared not speak its name. Then he said, what the left and right respectively love and hate are mostly flip sides of the same libertarian coin minted around 1967. Thanks to the 60s, we are all shamelessly selfish. This is what the New York Times thought would be a good way to celebrate America's birth. Well, Kurt Anderson calls it selfish. We call it self-reliance, minding your own business, staying out of unnecessary wars, and raising everybody's standard of living by pursuing your own interest and your own profit. My friend Brian Doherty, an editor at Reason magazine, wrote a great history of the libertarian movement a few years ago called Radicals for Capitalism. And in it, he makes two arguments. And they might sound like they can't be reconciled. First, he says, libertarian ideas are radical. And then he says they are deeply rooted in Western civilization, which now, quote, runs on approximately libertarian principles. Well, it's an interesting question. Can they both be true? I think they are both true. They are radical. They have challenged the established order in every era of history, and particularly in the last 500 years as they came together as a body of thought in England and the Netherlands and Western Europe and the United States. And they swept away a lot of the vestiges of the old order. Unfortunately, some of those vestiges have come back in modern guise. We got rid of the divine right of kings. We seem to have reestablished the divine right of Congress. And now we're getting back to the divine right of the president. Nevertheless, libertarians have a record to be proud of. We have been fighting ignorance, superstition, privilege, and power for many centuries. Brian Doherty wrote a great book. The New York Times ran a long review of it, which seemed kind of ignorant. And one of the things it said was, well, he complains, he's always telling you how great libertarianism is, but he doesn't tell you about the libertarians who haven't respected the rights of others. Really? What are those? Well, he says, Ayn Rand testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee. Most of you are too young to remember the era of HUAC. This was back when there were actual communists in America, and they were investigating them. Yes, it's true, Ayn Rand did testify, and some people would say you should not cooperate with a congressional witch hunt like that. But that's kind of rich coming from a newspaper that won a Pulitzer Prize for covering up the terror famine in Ukraine. All Ayn Rand said was there are communist ideas being put in American movies, but you shouldn't censor them. That's not the way you answer bad ideas. The New York Times won a Pulitzer Prize for Walter Duranty's reporting from Ukraine, and then their reporter Herbert Matthews played an important role in imposing Fidel Castro on the people of Cuba. So for them to suggest that some libertarian once said communism was a bad idea is a rich irony. Then they said, well, Murray Rothbard supported Strom Thurmond for president in 1948. Well, he sort of did. He was 22 years old, and it is embarrassing. And all those whose friends and forebears did not support the fellow traveling communist Henry Wallace in 1948 are entitled to criticize. And then the New York Times said, what about Milton Friedman? He advised the dictator of Chile, Pinochet, about how to have a better economy. Well, yes, that's what he did. He held a 45-minute meeting with a military dictator, and he told him, if you follow the certain rules, you will have a better economy. So I just wonder, should he have refused to advise the head of Chile's government on how to lift the burden from its people? And I noticed that the New York Times did not criticize Friedman for having a much longer relationship with the communist government of China. He went to China several times and he met at greater length with the leaders of China, and maybe in both Chile and China he played some role in bringing those people out of the darkness and into a more modern world. Chile now has the fastest growing, most successful economy in Latin America, and China has brought more people out of poverty in the past generation than any country in history. Neither country is a libertarian paradise, but that's not a bad record. And then he said, finally, Brian Doherty, what about this guy who was an anti-Semite? And I read this review and I said, and I wrote this actually in a blog post at the time, despite 30 years in the libertarian movement, and despite having read this book, I've never heard of this guy. But I go back, flipping through the index, flipping through the pages, and I finally find, oh yes, there's a reference to a guy who was an anti-Semite. And what did it say? It said that Leonard Read, one of the actual founding fathers of the libertarian movement, told people, don't have anything to do with this guy, he's an anti-Semite. So how does the New York Times know the guy's an anti-Semite? Because Leonard Read told people to stay away from him. So if that's the sum total of embarrassing libertarian moments, it's a pretty darn good record over 70 years or so. Modern liberals have to deal with the fact, not an embarrassing one, but a shameful one, that many of their forebears supported Stalin and the Communist Party, or were at least fellow travelers. As for conservatives, I could mention their long resistance to liberty and legal equality for blacks, women, and gays, but instead I'll just say George W. Bush and the Iraq War. In 70 years, libertarians have done nothing to compare to expressing support for limited government while also supporting Bush, his disastrous war, and his accumulation of unprecedented presidential power. So I go back to the point I made earlier. Libertarians have a record to be proud of and a record to build on.